Well, my greetings to you. I hope you're having a wonderful day. And I'm Dr. Michael McDonald. And in this video, I would like to present what I call the education interpretation of Plato's Allegory of the Cave. And then this would be one of the most familiar of the interpretations that have been, widely circulated for Plato. In other words, when you go to an education conference and they're trying to explain what's going on in teaching, a lot of times there will be people that speakers that will address the teacher's role and the student's role in some of the dynamics of education in terms of Plato's allegory of the cave. So I would call this a major and accepted interpretation. Some of the ones I'm going to be presenting are more speculative or come more from me, but the education interpretation and I would say the mystical interpretation are very well known and have been presented for a long time. However, it fits really well. And so in this video, I'd like to run through it at least quickly and identify some of the major points that we would do as we relate this to Plato himself. Now, in the education interpretation, what you have down in the cave, down here, is going to basically be your students, okay? Now, in Plato's true analogy, the people in the cave are men, and they're bound prisoners, aren't they? And they're watching a slideshow. So we're getting a little bit away from some of the dynamics that Plato had going on down inside the cave. Our emphasis is falling a little differently on each of the different interpretations, which, by the way, is how we know what a rich allegory we're dealing with. Allegory, again, can be is a series of related interpretations of a powerful symbol, and that symbol does direct thought. It's not ambiguous because it has many meanings. What it is multivalent, or what we would call rich with meanings. And as we go forward, we are unpacking those meanings. And as we do so, the emphasis falls out differently from place to place. Now, in this one, the prisoners, the student is not really bound, but they are in a state of ignorance, which does correspond with Plato's general characterization of what's going on when you're inside the cave and you're working off the light of the fire, which is your individual consciousness. The student is ignorant in that sense, because they haven't had time to accumulate knowledge. They're in school precisely so that they can gain knowledge. And then the type of knowledge that I'm emphasizing in my diagram here is mathematical knowledge. And that fits because over here, where we were dealing in Plato's fourfold line, remember that the part of the mind that was emphasized here was called dianoia. And it was mathematical principles that were one of the main examples that Plato had in mind. Plato himself loved geometry. At the entrance to his school, the academy, there was a big sign that said, anybody that's ignorant of geometry cannot enter. And Plato made, the mastery of advanced mathematics and geometry one of the main qualifications that you needed to have if you were going to be a philosopher king. In his great work, The Republic. So the reason for Plato's emphasis on mathematics was not, historically, was that he was influenced by the Pythagoreans. And Pythagoras was the one that made, some of the initial mathematical discoveries, in particular the Pythagorean Theorem, which is not, it could be illustrated here if this is a right triangle, that the square of the two sides is equal to the square of the hypotenuse. And then this is the type of knowledge that he said was possible and that represented something that was real, even though it wasn't material. In fact, precisely because it was not a material object, a particular thing, that was in the world of space and time. For Plato, it was more real because these principles are true in all times and all places. And this was his primary qualification for what knowledge would have to be. Knowledge would have to be always true. Okay, good deal. So what's going on with the education resembles a little bit the journey of the Bodhisattva, but of course a math teacher is not a Bodhisattva. My math teacher is over here, and one of the contrasts that we have between the ignorance over here and the knowledge over here is simply having been to some math classes and done the calculations and listened to what the teacher said. And that's what this math teacher has already done. The math teacher has graduated from college, right? So this is a mature person who has completely been through the process of learning and has mastered mathematics through a lot of hard work and a lot of training. And by the way, the sacrifice and efforts of a lot of other teachers who were this person's teacher. So it isn't that the student is a bad person, but they haven't done that work. And the problem is that unless you do that work for yourself, you will never understand mathematics. And mathematics is something you could understand, but there's only one way to understand it, and that's to do what this teacher did. So the teacher here, the math teacher, as I said, is not a bodhisattva, but they still return back into the cave. And in this case, I suppose the cave would be the classroom, really. And just as the bodhisattva's motive up here had been to, you know what I mean, dispel ignorance and bring other people to a point of enlightenment, the math teacher's motive is to share knowledge. The math teacher, yes, is getting paid for their time and is probably employed by a school district, but they didn't become a teacher for the sake of the money. The reason that they're doing that is because they have a love of knowledge and a knowledge of mathematics that they've built up and that they want to share with the next generation. All right, so the teacher returns back into the cave, and here's our journey. The teacher comes back in. Now we've got a classroom, and at this point we always have the engagement. Remember, in Plato's original story, the man who has become free returns into the cave and taps one of these guys on the shoulder and says, hey, there is a different life out there. There's such a thing as the sun. And if you'll make the journey with me, I can show you that. You'll experience it for yourself. One of the things that gets highlighted on the education interpretation is a particularly clear view of what's going on during this uphill journey and why Plato would characterize the uphill journey as having been, a difficult step-by-step uphill climb to get out of the cave. And there's a certain use of force. Plato even has the guy, dragging. The free man is dragging the prisoner because another thing that gets highlighted when you do the education interpretation is a certain reluctance on the part of the person who is trapped in ignorance to really want to escape. And that's part of what we have to deal with in the overall dynamic here, is that it isn't usually the case that you have a bunch of prisoners who are unsatisfied with their situation and really want to escape. Remember, they've never seen the sun for themselves. They've never been outside the cave. They don't know that there is such a thing. And all they've got is somebody tapping them on the shoulder and saying, hey, you're living in ignorance. There's a whole world that you could become a part of. Why don't you join me and listen to me? And that's essentially what's going on with the teacher's relationship with the student right here. And as Plato has, a guy kind of being grabbed by the collar and lifted out of that chair and dragged uphill to get out of the cave where they can see all this for themselves. That kind of accounts for a certain element of compulsion in education. In other words, we make students go to school, at least when we have a healthy society that wants to have a good education system that's free and available to all. that isn't a free choice for the student. That's what they need to do, and in effect, that's their job. And there can be a certain resentment, as you know. A lot of kids would rather be listening to their cell phones and social media and fooling around with each other and running around on skateboards, and they have 100 things they'd like to be doing other than studying math. And so I've kind of, homework would be the element of compulsion, along with the fact that you're required to go to school, and eventually a truant officer shows up if you don't go to school, at least in a well-run country. And so hopefully we do have education that's available, but it's actually a requirement. And so that's what I put down here with the teacher saying, well, do your homework. And the kid's saying, geez, when I get home, I want to watch TV, I want to do this, I want to do that. And the teacher says, no, you're going to do your homework. I've assigned an hour's worth of math, and I want you to have that done by tomorrow. Okay, and then he'd say, well, why should I do that? And that's the position of ignorance, by the way. There does have to be either an element of faith or an element of compulsion if you're going to get out of the cave at all. And there's always a question of how much you really want to get out of the cave. But in this case, I've got the teacher saying, well, if you don't do your homework, I'm going to call your parents and you're going to get into trouble and they'll take away your cell phone and all of this. So that is threats and compulsion, isn't it? But it's a good process. And what happens here is that step by step, and what needs to be emphasized is that student will never get out of the cave and understand the principles of mathematics or geometry for themselves unless they do the work for themselves. And that's why this compulsion is necessary. And that would be one explanation of the difficult uphill journey. Now, you notice also that our stage 4 more or less falls away under the education interpretation. Although for Pythagoras, there actually was, once you had understood or mastered the principles of mathematics, it could be the doorway to, a knowing of divine harmony or a doorway to other things. And education is a freeing process, and it is one that broadens your horizons, okay? Because we don't want to leave people down here wallowing around inside the cave where the only guidance they have is the light of their own individual consciousness. So we still make the journey from one light to another, and we still make the journey out of the cave. And under the education interpretation, we get a little more understanding of what that process might be like. And then we also have a good, really good example of stage 3 of Plato's Allegory, because math was the example that he used, and that works out perfectly in the education process. So, because we teach math, and math is part of the background of an educated person. Of course, there are other topics than mathematics that need to be mastered. But math is a clear example, and that's why I've used it here. And so we kind of are also uniquely under this one making a journey not just from ignorance to knowledge, but we're emphasizing that a certain work is involved. You have to take that step by step. You have to do the work for yourself. So I hope that whether you are a teacher or a student, you might have gotten some insight into the education process with the quick look that we've taken here at Plato's Allegory of the Cave with the education interpretation. Again, I'm Dr. Michael McDonald, and thank you so much for your time and attention. I hope that you will tune in, and we've got 5 more interpretations of the Allegory of the Cave, as well as some other interesting videos about Plato. All right, I hope to see you again soon. Bye.